During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese attacked the American gunboat USS Panay and 3 tankers on the Yangtze River near the Chinese capital of Nanjing on December 12, 1937. Japan and the United States were not at war at the time, and the US was officially neutral in the war between the Japanese and Chinese. The boats were part of an American naval operation called the Yangtze Patrol, and despite the US flag being prominently painted on the Panay and being displayed in clear vision, the Japanese claimed that they did not see it when attacking and sinking the ship. The response in the United States was rather mixed regarding how to respond to the Japanese attack. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt weighed his diplomatic and military responses to the Japanese as the American public was completely outraged over the attack. Just 40 years prior, the US had gone to war with Spain over the sinking of the USS Maine, and the takeaway from that war to Japan was not to mess with America's boats unless you plan on sinking all of them at once. Japan issued an official apology and paid the US cash. The key reasons why there was little retaliation was because there was some ambiguity on whether or not the attack was deliberate, and at the time it was ambiguous to the Americans, but it was definitely deliberate. And of course, the Great Depression was still doing its damage to the United States in 1937, which made the American population a little less willing to go to war, but that did not slow their massive outrage about the USS Panay. With all of that in mind, changes that could be made in this alternate timeline to have the US and Japan go to war over the USS Panay incident would be if it was proven to FDR and the American public that the Japanese attack was indeed deliberate, as it was, which wouldn't be hard because it was very clear that the USS Panay was a US ship and that the Japanese blatantly lied about it. Additionally, the Great Depression would have to be slightly less bad to get Americans even more up in arms about the sinking of the Panay. So I guess something that could be done on that front is if FDR was like, hey everybody, we're going to start up our war industry now so you all can get back to work so that we can fight the Japanese. So now war has started between the US and Japan in 1937. Yippee! How's it going to go now? To start, the Philippines would become fortified and the US immediately prepares the Pacific Fleet for war. Japan attacks very specific islands and makes huge gains. The early war sees jungle fighting where the Japanese attack slightly more fortified American positions such as the Philippines. The USA is a sleeping giant but hasn't done the Lend-Lease program with Britain in this alternate timeline as the Japanese-American War has begun before Germany has even invaded Poland. The US will immediately start their wartime economy, but it will be slower than it was in our timeline as America wasn't near as prepared for war in 1937 as it was in 1941. And in 1941, the US was not prepared for war at all, so keep that in mind. So I give it probably until 1939 before the US is the economic giant that everyone knew and loved in World War II. Additionally, in 1937, the Pact of Steel and Tripartite Pact have not been signed yet, so Germany and Italy are not going to get involved in this war yet. Therefore, one consequence this war might have on the Japanese could be that these agreements are not signed by 1939. If the Germans and Italians have a combined IQ of 20, then they would not ally themselves with the Japanese who are at war with the angry economic powerhouse of America. But you know, this is the angry mustache model and bald spaghetti server that we're talking about. These are idiots who knew nothing about what they would be able to do. So you know what? Who knows what they're going to do in this alternate timeline? Back to the war. The US and China fight against Japan while the British and French retain temporary neutrality, but Britain would likely toss around the idea of going to war with Japan around 1940, where perhaps the US and Britain agree to go to war with their enemies. The US supplies would take a while to reach China, so I feel like the Chinese situation with Japan goes pretty similar to how it did in our timeline up until 1939, where US support pushes Japan back. The American and Japanese navies and air forces battle it out years before they did in our timeline, and that will have several major impacts on the war which I cannot properly determine in this alternate timeline. But just like in our timeline, like I said before, I predict initial Japanese gains and eventual American dominance in the war. Meanwhile, in Europe, Germany invades Czechoslovakia and triggers World War II in 1938 because in this alternate timeline, it's heavily possible that the Allies are more willing to go to war with Germany in 1938 with America having been at war with the Japanese for a year already. And in that time, the British and French have been rearming some of their military forces and preparing for a potential war, and their officers have been learning from their American counterparts in the war between the US and Japanese about what World War II is really going to be like with tanks, planes, and massive maneuver warfare. The war in Europe is going to be a bit fuzzy for starting in 1938 as Germany has been rearming but isn't as rearmed as they were in 1939. Also combine that with the fact that Britain and France are more ready for war than they were in our timeline despite the war starting in 1938. The British and French will still prepare an initial defensive war with Poland joining in. However, the Germans would likely reach out to the USSR a year earlier than they did in our timeline to do the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they divided up Europe between the two powers and agreed to conquer them together. I cannot possibly accurately predict the full course of this war, and I know that's likely why you came to this video, but I'd say overall that the Allies still win the war around maybe 1943, and Germany and the USSR still go to war with one another after Germany has a more costly onslaught into Western Europe. I'd say the Germans wait a little bit before attacking the Soviets in order to recover from the Western Front, but the results of an alternate winter war where the Soviets get absolutely humiliated by the Finns could completely change that. There's a lot of unknown factors, but that's alternate history for you. And that is my best prediction on if the US and Japan went to war over the USS Panay incident. What do you think would have happened if the US and Japan fought one another in 1937? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.